The call came on a Wednesday morning, not the kind of call anyone in the royal household ever truly prepares for, even when they know it is coming, even when the doctors have given their measured pronouncements and the timelines have been quietly communicated through the palace's careful channels of discretion. William was in his study at Kensington Palace, already deep into the morning's briefings, the kind of administrative machinery that never stops regardless of what is happening in the private chambers of a family's life, when his private secretary appeared at the door with an expression that said everything before a single word was spoken. The king had passed in the early hours of the morning, peacefully, surrounded by those he loved, and the world as William had always known it had shifted on its axis in a way that was both entirely expected and completely impossible to prepare for. He sat for a moment in the silence that followed, the briefing papers still open on his desk, his cold coffee still in its cup, and understood with a clarity that was almost physical that he was no longer the Prince of Wales. He was the king. What the public did not know in those first hours, what the carefully worded palace statements and the solemn BBC broadcasts and the black-draped social media posts could not convey, was that William's ascension to the throne carried with it a secret that had been entrusted to exactly one person outside of Charles himself. Princess and the Princess Royal, 74 years old and as formidable as she had ever been, had been holding that secret for weeks, waiting for the moment when it would need to be revealed, understanding that the timing of its delivery would matter as much as the content itself. She had agreed to carry this burden because her brother had asked her to, and because she understood better than almost anyone alive what it meant to serve the institution, even when the institution demanded impossible things, and had spent a lifetime being the most quietly powerful member of a family that conducted its most important business in the spaces between public appearances, and this final commission from her dying brother was perhaps the most consequential thing she had ever been asked to do. The days immediately following Charles's death moved with the particular velocity that royal protocol demands, a choreography so meticulously prepared that it almost seemed to move of its own momentum, pulling everyone in the family into their designated roles without pause for the ordinary human business of grief. William stood at the center of it all with Catherine beside him, receiving the formal instruments of accession, addressing the nation with words that had been refined through multiple drafts, but that he delivered with a steadiness that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than preparation. He spoke about his father with measured love, about duty with the conviction of a man who had been preparing for this since birth, and about the future with a careful optimism that acknowledged the weight of the moment without being crushed by it. The public responded with the particular mixture of mourning and hope that the British people seemed to reserve for these historic transitions, understanding that they were watching something irreversible, a door closing on one era and opening onto another whose shape could not yet be fully seen. Harry had returned from California within 24 hours of the announcement. The reconciliation that had begun in Scotland in those fragile, careful conversations facilitated by, and had continued in increments over the weeks of their father's decline, phone calls and tentative visits that were nothing like the easy brotherhood of their childhood, but were something better than the years of estrangement that had preceded them. He arrived looking exhausted, his face carrying the particular hollowness of a man who had been grieving from a great distance and had now arrived at the source of his grief to find it even more real than his imagination had prepared him for. William met him at the airport, not a grand gesture, but a quiet one, the two of them standing together on the tarmac for a moment before the security detail closed in and the careful machinery of a royal arrival took over. They had said what needed to be said in Scotland. What remained now was simply to be present together in the aftermath of loss. It was 3 days after the funeral, when the formal mourning period had passed its most acute phase and the palace had returned to something approximating its usual controlled rhythm, that Anne asked William to meet her privately. She had been deliberate about the timing, understanding that grief needed some room to settle before a revelation of this magnitude could be properly absorbed, and that William needed to have moved through the most public dimensions of his accession before he could sit quietly with what his father had left for him to know. She came to Windsor, to the private apartments that were now William's in a way they had never quite been before, and she came alone, carrying a sealed document that Charles had prepared with his solicitors in the final weeks of his life, separate from his official will, separate from the formal instruments of royal succession, a personal communication intended for his eldest son at the moment when the crown had fully settled on his head, and the reality of what he had inherited could finally be confronted honestly. William received her in the same study where Charles had once sat with and told her he was dying, the room that seemed to have become the designated space for the family's most consequential conversations, and something in his expression when she arrived suggested that he already understood this was not a routine visit, and had never been one for unnecessary preamble. She sat across from him, placed the document on the table between them, and told him that what he was about to read was his father's final gift to him, not the crown, not the palaces, not the centuries of accumulated institutional weight, but the truth about the choices that had been made during William's own formation as heir, choices that Charles believed his son deserved to understand fully now that he was king, because a king who does not understand the forces that shaped him is a king who will repeat the mistakes of the past without recognizing them. The document was long and written in Charles's unmistakable hand, the handwriting that William had grown up seeing on letters and notes and the margins of official papers, and reading it in the silence of that study with, and watching him was one of the most disorienting experiences of his life. Charles had written with a candor that he had rarely managed in person, the kind of honesty that becomes possible when a man knows he is writing for the last time and has nothing left to protect. He wrote about the decisions made in the years following Diana's death, decisions about how William should be raised and prepared and protected, decisions that Charles now recognized had come partly from genuine duty and partly from his own unprocessed guilt and grief. He wrote about the ways in which the palace machinery had been organized around William's future kingship in ways that had created invisible walls between William and the world, between William and his brother, between William and a full understanding of his own emotions and needs. He wrote about specific choices regarding the press, the security arrangements, the financial structures, the staff appointments, all the invisible architecture of royal life that William had grown up inside without fully seeing. He wrote about moments when William's comfort and image had been prioritized over Harry's well-being in ways that Charles had told himself were necessary, but now recognized as failures of parenthood dressed up as institutional responsibility. He wrote about advisors whose counsel he had taken when he should have trusted his own instincts as a father, about opportunities for honest conversation that he had let pass because the machinery of monarchy always seemed to demand something more urgent. And he wrote about the specific private conversations he had held with various figures in the palace over the years, conversations in which decisions were made that had consequences William had never been fully told about, consequences that had shaped the public narrative of the royal family in ways that were not always honest and not always fair. What William felt reading through these pages was not simple. It was not the clean shock of revelation or the straightforward grief of a son mourning his father's failures. It was something more complex and less manageable, a kind of excavation happening in real time, as though the ground he had been standing on his entire life was being gently but insistently turned over to reveal the root system beneath it. He found himself re-examining things he had believed he understood, moments from his childhood and adolescence and early adulthood that he had filed away under particular headings, reassigning them now to different categories as Charles's account provided context that changed their meaning. He found himself thinking about Harry, about the conversations they had begun in Scotland and continued through the weeks of their father's illness, and understanding some of what had driven his brother in ways that the abstract knowledge of institutional bias had not quite made visceral until now. And waited. She was patient in the way that people are patient when they have done this before, when they have been the one who sits across from another person's reckoning and understands that the most useful thing they can do is simply remain present without trying to manage the process. She had been the one Charles called when their mother was dying. She had been the one who held certain truths in trust when they were too large or too sharp for the ordinary channels of family communication. She had spent decades being the most reliable member of an institution that did not always reward reliability, and she had learned that the particular service of bearing witness to someone else's grief and revelation required a kind of stillness that most people found difficult to maintain. When William finally set down the last page and looked up at her, what she saw in his face was not the composed heir apparent or the newly crowned king. It was something closer to the boy she had watched grow up, the boy who had walked behind his mother's coffin at 10 years old with a steadiness that had broken everyone's heart precisely because it was so complete, so perfectly performed, so much the product of a system that needed him to be dignified when what he needed was permission to fall apart. She had loved that boy with the particular fierce protectiveness of an aunt who understood what was being asked of him and could not prevent it and could only be available in the spaces where the institution could not reach. She loved the man he had become in the same way, with the same mixture of admiration and sorrow for everything the becoming had cost him. "I need to speak to Harry," William said finally, and nodded because this was the answer she had been hoping for and had not allowed herself to assume. "Not because Charles asked it of us," he continued, "not to honor his memory or satisfy the palace communications team or give the public the narrative they want. Because he needs to know what I know now, and because I think we have been angry at each other for the wrong reasons for a very long time, and I am tired of carrying that anger into whatever this is supposed to become." He gestured around him, at the room, at the enormous invisible weight that had settled on his shoulders in the days since the call came from Windsor, at the whole impossible inheritance of his position. "I cannot be the king this country needs if I am carrying all of this unprocessed. Harry is part of that. This is part of that." And told him there was one more thing. She reached into the folder she had brought and withdrew a smaller envelope sealed with wax, bearing William's name in Charles's handwriting, this one separate from a longer document, this one clearly more personal. She told him that Charles had written this one last, in the final week before he died, when he was very weak, but his mind was still clear, and that he had asked and to give it to William not on the day of his accession, but a few days after, when the first wave had passed and William could receive it properly. She set it on the table and told him she would leave him alone to read it. The letter inside was shorter than the document, barely 2 pages, but it was different in register from everything else Charles had written. There was no institutional analysis here, no careful accounting of decisions and their consequences. This was simply a father writing to his son, possibly for the last time, without the protection of formality or the distance of historical framing. Charles wrote about watching William be born and feeling a love that terrified him because it was so much larger than anything he knew how to hold. He wrote about Diana, about the ways in which her presence had opened something in William that Charles had recognized as a gift, even when he did not know how to nurture it himself, the empathy, the directness, the instinct to connect with people across the barriers of rank and ceremony. He wrote that he had spent years trying to ensure William would be a great king and had not always remembered to ensure he would be a whole person, and that he understood now that a man who is not whole cannot be great at anything for very long without the fractures beginning to show. He told William that he was proud of him, not in the formal way that royal parents express pride as an institutional endorsement, but genuinely, specifically, in the way that a father who has made many mistakes and watched his child become a man despite those mistakes feels pride as something closer to gratitude. He told William that Catherine was the best thing that had ever happened to their family, not just to William personally, but to the institution, because she had brought into the heart of the monarchy something it had been missing for generations, which was a person who was simply and unaffectedly good. He told him that George and Charlotte and Louis deserved a father who allowed himself to be known by them, who did not disappear behind duty and dignity when what they needed was presence and vulnerability, and that he hoped William had learned from Charles's failures enough to give them what Charles had not always managed to give William himself. And at the very end, he wrote about, and he wrote that his sister was the most underestimated member of their family, and possibly the most important, that she had been holding the monarchy together in ways that never made the front pages and never would, and that William should listen to her when she spoke, because she was almost always right, and she would tell him the truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable. He told William that he had asked Anne to carry all of this because she was the only one he trusted to deliver it with the right combination of honesty and compassion, and that asking her had required admitting to himself that he had not always been adequate to his own responsibilities, which was perhaps the hardest admission he had ever made. When Harry arrived the following morning, William was waiting for him in the same study, the documents arranged on the table between the two chairs that Anne had placed facing each other the day before. Harry came in with the careful guardedness that had become his default setting in family contexts, the self-protection of a man who had been hurt enough times in a particular environment to approach it always with part of himself held in reserve, ready to withdraw if the situation required it. But he saw something different in William's face that morning, something that had not been there even in Scotland, a quality of openness that was new or perhaps very old, recovered rather than acquired. William told him to sit down, and then he gave Harry the document their father had written, and he watched his brother read it with the same excavating attention that he himself had brought to it the day before. They talked for 4 hours, not the careful, lawyerly conversations of Scotland, measured against the risk of saying something that could be weaponized, but something rawer and less managed. William told Harry what it had been like to carry the succession from earliest childhood, not as a complaint, but as a truth he had never been permitted to speak plainly, the particular loneliness of being the heir, the sense of being loved conditionally on the performance of duty, the way intimacy had always seemed to be a luxury he could not afford because it came with vulnerabilities the institution could not protect. Harry told William things he had said in books and interviews, but that somehow landed differently in this room with his brother's full attention. Things about the specific texture of being the spare, the particular erosion of being positioned as a contrast to rather than a companion for the heir, the way the system had not been designed to hold them both as complete people, only to hold William as king and Harry as auxiliary. They talked about Diana with a freedom they had not managed in years, because the grief had calcified into something too painful to approach directly, and the public mythology around her had made honest conversation feel almost sacrilegious. But Charles's letter had broken something open, had given them permission to be her sons without the performance that role had accumulated, and they found in that conversation something they had both been missing without quite being able to name it, which was the experience of grieving her together as brothers, as the two people in the world who had loved her in the specific, irreplaceable way that only her sons could have loved her, and came in the late afternoon to find them in a silence that was different from the silences she had witnessed in that room before, not the silence of people who had run out of things to say, but the silence of people who had said enough and were now sitting with it, letting it settle into their bodies and their understanding of each other. She looked at them both for a moment and felt something that in someone less controlled might have been described as relief, though she experienced it more as the quiet satisfaction of a commission completed, a promise kept, a duty discharged with the care it deserved. What William was beginning to understand, what the document and the letter and the conversation with Harry had clarified in ways that would take months and perhaps years to fully unfold, was that the crown he had inherited was not simply an institution, but a relationship, a web of human connections and histories and failures and attempts at repair that could not be separated from the personal story of the family that wore it. He could not be the king the country needed by being only the public figure his accession required. He had to be the son who had read his father's honest account and wept and groaned from it. He had to be the brother who had sat across from Harry and said the things that needed saying and heard the things that needed hearing. He had to be the husband who told Catherine that evening everything that had passed in that room and received her response with the openness she deserved. He had to be the father who went to George and Charlotte and Louis that night and was simply present with them in their grief without the armor that the institution kept offering him and that he kept being tempted to put on. Princess and drove back to Gatcombe Park that evening through the same landscape she had driven through on that early morning weeks before when she had been summoned to Windsor to receive her brother's final commission. The light was different now, spring rather than winter's edge, the countryside showing its first soft green. She thought about Charles as she drove, not the king, but her brother, The complicated, difficult, brilliant, flawed man she had known for 75 years, who had loved his sons imperfectly and tried to love them better, and had found in the last months of his life the courage to attempt repairs he had not managed while he was healthy. She thought about William, about the particular quality of attention he had brought to everything he read and heard in those days, the sense of a man genuinely receiving truth rather than processing it for later management, and she thought that Charles might have been right, that there was something of Diana in him that had always been there, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. She had done what her brother asked. She had delivered his final secret, not as an accusation or a confession, but as a gift, the gift of truth clearly told by someone who no longer had anything to protect, and she had witnessed its reception with the care the moment required. The monarchy would survive. It had survived worse than this and would face worse than this in the years ahead. And William would face those challenges carrying the full inheritance of who he was and where he had come from. Not just the institutional weight, but the human story, the losses and the failures and the reconciliations and the love that had formed him, and suspected that made him better equipped for what was coming than any amount of preparation in briefing books and formal training could have managed. The truth, delivered at the right moment by the right person, has a way of building foundations that nothing else quite can. Charles had understood that even at the end, perhaps especially at the end, the crown had passed, the secret had been told, the brothers were talking, and somewhere in all of that, imperfect and unfinished as it was, something that had been broken for a long time was being slowly and with great difficulty put back together again.